Oh.
Hi, Henry. How you doing?
Not too bad. In the throes of moving house and moving office, so but all a little crazy here.
Sounds like a lot of throws.
Yeah. I don't know how they're going to cut the picture, but depending on how they cut it, there may be a vista of blank bookshelves and boxes behind me, representing the chaos that is my office. But the chaos that is my apartment is even crazier. So I figured that this.
Why are you moving offices?
We're moving offices because the building where we were in temporary accommodation in the political science department for a couple of years. Now that is coming to an end, and we're moving to what we were promised is a new purpose-built buildings. Hopefully it'll be nicer than the current digs, but I have yet to see. Apparently you can go and you can see what's happening on the site, but you still need a hard hat to get in there, so I haven't quite mustered up the courage to do that.
You're supposed to move like this week, and you still need a hard hat to get in?
Supposed to move a couple of weeks from now. But because I've been trying to get work done on packing at home as well, I've started packing my office a little bit early, and so I'm talking from amid a chaos of boxes, piles of books, and as I say, blank bookshelves behind me, rather than the usual kinds of bookshelves that you expect. And I think there's a kind of an academic myth that you see in the movies, which is that academics, they live in these offices, they have nice cushy leather armchairs, they have very expensive looking bookshelves and whatever, and this is not what we live in. I mean, we have okay bookshelves, we have whiteboard walls, and sort of where the evidence of many occupants before us is all too obvious to be seen. We have slightly ratty office furniture, and we have to do most of the moving ourselves and most of the labeling and boxing because naturally, this is not George Washington University is an institution which doesn't have an awful lot of spare money to throw around to do things like this for professors.
Well, it's a hard life, Henry.
It's tough, I can tell you. Being an assistant professor, it's hard. You have no idea what it's like out there. I don't know what it's like for you guys in Cato in the tough, brutal world of think tanks, but us professors, we've got it bad.
We've got a beautiful building, and I like my office quite a lot. Today, though, if I look a little bit more, a little shinier than usual, it's because our HVAC system failed to reset properly over the weekend, and so I came in this morning. It was about 600 degrees, not far from the surface of the sun, whatever that is, and it's been taking all day for the air conditioner to catch up. So if you see sweat dripping down my brow, it's not because you're grilling me or anything like that.
Okay, well, hopefully this won't be a sort of a Nixon versus Kennedy kind of TV appearance.
You'll keep your cool.
I don't know. I have the Irish thing, but I'm not sure I have all that much else of the Kennedy charisma. So we do what we can with what we have. Anyway, I guess we better get on to substantive discussions. And I thought maybe we'd begin talking today by talking about this graph which has been roiling the wonkier sections of the blogosphere, mostly roiling them, I think, with hilarity. This is something which appeared in the Wall Street Journal as a purported proof that the famous Laffer Curve, which is a relationship between the amount of taxes that you raise and GDP and stuff, it was supposed to be a definitive proof that the Laffer Curve had indeed been found, but it was the kind of thing that you might expect, sort of a 10-year-old and sort of drawing, sort of a wiggly curve in a graph to get, and this appeared in the Wall Street Journal. So a lot of economists and other social scientists have been getting a lot of entertainment out of this.
So this was a piece that was reporting on. I'm kind of actually confused about it. Was it something that Kevin Hassett wrote, or was it as reporting on work that he'd done?
That's not entirely clear. There have been different theories going back and forth. If you look at Mark Thoma's economic blog, which is where a lot of this discussion has taken place, my memory is that he wasn't in fact sure that Kevin Hassett himself had been responsible for producing the graph, although the graph does actually sort of bear his name. It says on sort of source Kevin Hassett stroke OECD, as far as I recall. recall. So certainly his name is attached to it. What role he himself played in actually preparing the graph, I don't know. But really, this is it's knockabout kind of stuff. It's kind of stuff which I think any first-year undergraduate in a social sciences course would be failed for. It's an exercise, not even a very sophisticated exercise in curve fitting. More I sort of look at the graph and sort of squint in order to see what kind of.
Yep. Yeah, let's describe what it is. It's about corporate tax rates, right? It's about capital gains taxes. Is that right?
It's about corporate. It's graphing corporate tax rates.
Corporate tax rates. And the article was about how, given the German cut in their corporate tax rate, the U.S. now has one of the highest corporate tax rates of any developed country, and the article was trying to demonstrate that we could perhaps raise more revenue by cutting our corporate tax rate because of the logic of optimal tax theory or the Laffer Curve, which in the Laffer Curve, I guess, for our non-economists like me, is a curve that just shows that at one limit, if you have zero taxes, you'll raise zero revenue, and if you have a tax rate of 100%, you'll get zero revenue because no one will work. And somewhere in the middle, between 0 and 100% tax rate, you can optimize government revenue. And it also implies that that there are two different tax rates for every amount of revenue on either side of the curve. And so the debate about this is about the substantive debate is about whether our tax rate is to the left side of the peak or to the right side of the peak on the curve, right?
More or less. As I understand it, so the Laffer curve does represent what is, I think, a pretty real intuition that at a certain point, if you keep on taxing the bejesus out of people, at a certain point, this is going to result in a sort of a shortfall of revenue. But the question is whether or not the U.S. rate is anywhere near that. Paul Krugman has a very nice discussion of all of this and where the Laffer curve came from in his book Peddling Prosperity. And I think the upshot is that there aren't very many serious economists out there, and certainly not very many economists who are supply-side economists would be considered to be serious economists. There aren't very many serious economists out there who believe that the US rate at the moment is or is likely to be anywhere near the Laffer curve. And in fact, if we look at the trend over the last a few decades, we see that taxes, both personal taxation and other forms of taxation, have fallen significantly, according to my understanding, which I have to confess I didn't update right before coming to talk to you.
Yeah, I dug around for about 5 minutes to find what I could find, because tax policy is not my specialty by any means. The most relevant thing I could find was a paper by a couple German economists at Humboldt in Berlin, which they compare the U.S. with I forget how many of the EU countries, like 15 of the EU countries. And they seem to think that the U.S. is, they're at least given the specification of their model, the U.S. is well to the left of the sort of peak of the Laffer curve, while the EU countries are quite close in a lot of their different forms of taxes to the peak tax, the tax at which the tax rate at which you'll maximize revenue, but past which you'll start getting diminishing revenue. If that's indicative of conventional wisdom, then it's saying that we are not to the point where cutting taxes would increase revenue. Even the European countries who have higher tax rates in certain things, the U.S. does have a high corporate tax rate, but it's lower in quite a bit lower in the highest tax bracket for personal income tax and things like that.
I think that's right, and I also think that supply-side economics is not a very popular theory these days, except outside the except within the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal, which did quite a lot to launch it in the first place. And I think there are pretty good reasons for that. Empirically, it just doesn't tell us very much about the way in which the real world works, and it seems to, frankly, have been more useful as a ideological smokescreen than as a way of telling us anything about the world. Certainly, there was a lot of obfuscation about a sort of Laffer Curve type ideas when Bush was introducing the economic justifications for his tax cuts. And I understand that's one of the reasons that a couple of economists are upset with Greg Mankiw, because they feel that he didn't do anywhere near as much as he might have done to so to basically sort of bring home the realities of economic orthodoxy, which indeed he espouses, albeit on the right wing, when he was in the policy in the corridors of power.
Yeah, I think part of the issue is the sort of ideological aspects of tax policy. Obviously, aren't people's views don't line up behind the best theoretical view about the point at which you can maximize government revenue through tax policy, right? Like, people have independent normative ideas about just taxation that tend to drive their opinions, and probably tend to drive what sort of body of research they're going to find, most convincing in the long run. So it's kind of funny, because I don't really understand myself, what. Tell me, what's your characterize for me what supply side economics is supposed to be about. Because it's interestingly enough, it's not something that is obvious to me, even though this is something that's popular in my milieu. Tell me what you think of when you think of supply-side economics.
Okay, well, this is a top-of-the-head definition. As I say, I think Paul Krugman's Peddling Prosperity is the best book to go to here for a pretty heated argument about what he considered to be then the crazies on the left and the right of the spectrum. I think he's less concerned about the people who he thought were crazy on the left side of the spectrum that he's less concerned about them now than he used to be. But effectively, I think supply-side economics is the idea that by tackling the supply side of the economy, in other words, by, for example, by slashing tax rates, you're going to release an awful lot of sort of economic energy, which is basically going to allow you to have your lunch and to eat it as well. So that by slashing tax rates, you on the one hand free up a lot of economic, you free up a lot of economic capital. You encourage people, you give them the incentives to be economically productive, and you're able to have your cake and eat it as well, because the actual tax revenue that you get are likely to increase to such an extent that the government doesn't actually lose any revenue. So, in other words, the increased money it gets from taxing at a lower rate, more activity, is going to be more than enough to compensate for what it had previously raised through higher taxes on a lower amount of economic activity. And my understanding of the economic debate is that there's little disagreement among economists that taxation is going to impose on sort of negative incentives for various forms of entrepreneurial activity. That is basic. If you believe basic economic theory, that's what you're going to get. But the idea that this would be enough to even begin to compensate for the amounts of money, the revenue that the government would lose, was from the beginning extremely controversial, and I think at the moment is more or less laughable. I don't think anybody who is at all even slightly a serious economist would believe it. And you also see people like William Crystal having effectively admitted that they didn't believe it either, but that they just thought that this was a nice way that they could ideologically justify cutting taxes, which is what they wanted to do in the first place, and clearly what a lot of you guys want to do in the first place. But I don't think that it's at all necessary to use economically bogus arguments in order to push that case.
Yeah, I've always been a little bit confused because I have noticed there's a kind of shuffle that goes on with some people on the right, where they'll give you the supply side argument that, okay, well, if we cut taxes, we'll raise revenue because we'll have released, entrepreneurial energy. But then if you say, well, no, it looks like we actually won't increase revenue, that given if we take the current level of spending, or at least the current level of spending growth is fixed, cutting this tax is going to lead to a larger deficit. And then you get some of the same people going, okay, yeah, then the deficits then will create an incentive to cut spending. So you get the argument on the one hand, the supply side argument that cutting taxes will increase revenues, but then if you show that it's not going to increase revenues, but instead
then there's a starve the beast.
And then the starve the beast argument comes in, and I've always just been completely, utterly confused by that chain of logic. One of the first things that I wrote about when I got to Cato was an op-ed about why I didn't buy starve the beast arguments, because they really depend on a psychological assumption about the motivations that are going to drive people who are electing their representatives, that people will start demanding spending cuts if they start seeing the deficit going up. But it's not clear that that's the case if they think that they can offload those eventual tax increases on their children or on their grandchildren, that they might be happy to have those deficits. And so I'm not sure that why there would be a good reason why.
Why you would want to.
Yeah, so I've always been a little bit confused. Now, I don't think the idea by raising revenue by cutting taxes is laughable at all. I mean, just in principle, it's almost, it's probably a theorem that it's true that there's a certain point at which you get diminishing return from levying additional taxes, and the key variable, I think, in the models of this is the elasticity of labor supply, and which is about suppose my income that I'm being taxed at 30%, and then my tax goes up to 40%. What does that do to my willingness to work? And if it reduces my actual hours that I work and thus my income, then you might lose income from having raised the tax on me. That's the idea. I'm not sure, in principle, how to specify the elasticity of labor supply in a principled way. So I don't know how to do that. But it strikes me as it's kind of obvious that you're going to get some kind of such demotivating effect from taxes at some rate or other. It's just an open question of what that rate is, and I think it's plausible that we are not actually near it. But there's all sorts of different mechanisms where you get get the kinds of effects, supply side like effects, like in the Wall Street Journal piece that was widely scorned. I mean, I think one of the things that it was pointing out was it was talking less about the sort of demotivating effects of higher tax rates and more about the effects of tax competition on revenue. So if you're talking about corporate tax rates, if you raise the corporate tax rates and the corporation can move to a different jurisdiction that has lower tax rates, then you're going to see a reduction in your overall revenues because, this whole company, this subject of taxation has moved to a different jurisdiction. That's a different mechanism, and I think there are lots of different mechanisms that can lead to that same kind of result, which is probably what are you familiar with that? Was it Howard Gardner who did the famous parody of the Laffer Curve?
I'm not actually.
It starts out at 0, and then it goes up, and then it's a bunch of sort of like random loop-de-loops, and goes back to 0 at the other extreme, which is a way of saying that there's so many variables in the middle of the model about what's going to happen that it's not obvious that you're going to get a smooth, parabola. You might get all sorts of disturbances based on the very specific incentives that are embedded in a particular tax code, and so I'm not sure it's crazy. I don't think it's crazy at all to suggest that you might reduce tax revenue from corporations by having a much higher corporate tax rate, if that does in fact tend to lead corporations to move to different jurisdictions. I don't know whether they are or whether they have. But conceptually, that makes sense to me.
Well, I think getting on there are a couple of different points in there. One, I think this is something we both agree on, that there is a point at which one can expect that these kinds of supply side effects are going to come into being. And I think there is good historical evidence for this. If you look at, for example, Douglas North's work on the predatory state from the right side of the political spectrum, or Margaret Levy's work from the left side of the political spectrum, you get a broad agreement there that so when you have a state which is overly rapacious, this is going to sort of decrease economic growth for a variety of reasons. So primarily to do with individuals' incentives to produce, when they know that the state can basically tax away 100% of their profits at a moment's notice. If it
a lot of optimal dictator theory is about, your profit seeking, your sort of optimizing dictator is going to be sensitive to these effects, right? You're going to get less. You're going to be able to extract fewer rents from the people that you rule over if you ride them too hard.
And I think on that level it actually works. But on the level of sort of what is actually happening in the day-to-day world, I think that the answer to the too many variables problem is a very real and substantial problem. And this is something Megan McArdle wrote frankly, I think, pretty intellectually, I think it was her at the Economist Free Exchange blog. She wrote a rather...
I said, who can tell?
Who can tell? But she certainly has responded afterwards as if it was her. And she wrote what seemed to me to be a rather intellectually confused response to my co-blogger Kieran Healy, who had basically said, well, sort of the problem with a lot of these sort of things is you see people saying you want to take this state or that state out of the equation when you're looking at these when you're looking at the set of cases that you want to look at, because this state or that state has some exceptional or unusual features that make it statistically an outlier. But the problem with that kind of approach is exactly because of this too many variables thing. So you've got a problem where, one, you have a very small number of cases if you're confining this to advanced industrialized countries. Number two, there's an incredible amount of uncontrolled variation among those cases, which you have no way of controlling, again, because of the small number of cases. So if you start deducting outliers that don't fit neatly into your boxes, then you are liable to find yourself getting into trouble very quickly. And I think this, sort of this reflects...
Everybody's an outlier in some dimension, right?
Everybody is an outlier in some dimension. And certainly, I think Kieran was... he was replicating a generally accepted truism among the people who study advanced industrialized economies, whether they be political scientists, sociologists, or economists, is that this is basically licensed to cherry pick, and that you really end up with not very intellectually convincing answers at the end of the day. The problem is, of course, that because there are all of these confounding variables, that very often the kinds of results that you get look exceedingly messy and are exceedingly difficult to interpret. So, which brings us back sort of in a roundabout kind of way to the question of whether or not we do have evidence of countries fleeing of sort of high tax jurisdiction, or companies fleeing high tax jurisdictions. And here there is some evidence, but the evidence is somewhat mixed. That certainly there have been some very well publicized cases in the US, especially so, seeing as US tax code allows sort of companies to get away with some rather peculiar shenanigans in places, sort of in offshore jurisdictions, but still effectively operate as if they were US companies in many other ways. But overall, there isn't all that much evidence of massive flight, as best as I read the literature, from high corporate tax jurisdictions to low corporate tax jurisdictions, certainly much less than you might expect to see. And again, I think that the problem here is that there are a lot of other confounding things. Clearly, if you're a business, high tax versus low tax is going to be something that you're going to think about very carefully. But there are also a lot of ways in which you can get around that. First of all, you can do a lot of manipulation of your internal flows if you're a multinational, so that even if you don't flee the country, you have a offshore subsidiary set up in a low tax jurisdiction, such as, to take a random example, Ireland, which seemingly accounts for a very large amount of your profits. There's a lot of stuff that you can do.
But that's going to be a mechanism that even if the company's not leaving, that's still going to reduce their taxable revenue, right?
Yeah, and there's certainly, and that is that. My understanding, again, the empirical literature is mixed. This actually is a good segue into the discussion that we were going to have about the Mankiw piece. It's very, very hard to put your finger on sort of hard and fast numbers here, because we're really talking about sophisticated means of tax avoidance here, and it's very, very hard to define what tax avoidance actually is, when it's legitimate, when it's illegitimate. It's even harder to gather good data on it, because clearly businesses don't have very much interest in providing good data on this. So they want to maintain that this is all perfectly legitimate and justified by their operationals and whatever. But there is some reason to believe that there is a substantial, that there are substantial opportunities for tax avoidance strategies, and this presumably does exercise, does have some real consequences for whether this is a Laffer Curve type thing or not. I don't think it's at that level, but there is some evidence.
That's one of the things that confuses me. That there's a point at which I'm not sure what counts as being like about the Laffer Curve, right? I'm not sure if the idea of it is pinned to a particular mechanism, such as just so if the whole model is about the elasticity of labor supply, then that's one thing. If the model has to do with all sorts of sort of dynamic growth effects of different tax structures because of systematic corporate dodging of their of corporate taxes. I'm sorry, my phone is beeping and it doesn't seem to stop. There it goes. Then I'm not sure what the Laffer Curve in particular is supposed to be about. Whether it's about the whole suite of mechanisms by which a higher tax rate can lead to lower revenue, or if it's supposed to be about just one of those ways, because there's probably an indefinite number of different ways that higher taxes could lead to lower revenues. The question is which ones are just kind of empirically realistic. You could. There might, you could have a model where people are just allergic to taxes above a certain amount, and they voluntarily pay their taxes, and after that amount they won't pay their taxes, and the state has no ability to collect them if people don't voluntarily pay them, and so you go from a high tax rate, high revenues to no revenues at all because people stopped voluntarily paying them past. You can understand how there could be all sorts of different ways this could happen. Well, the thing that I'm interested in is why, if it's happening, why exactly it is happening.
Well, my understanding is, as I say, the empirical evidence is somewhat confused and confusing. And there are a couple of things. First of all, I think the original Laffer Curve argument, if this is all about encouraging entrepreneurial dynamism, so the supply side, I think the original Laffer Curve argument is purely about seeking to sort of tap untapped resources. It isn't about competition between different taxation regimes. There is the secondary question, which is the question of competition between these regimes, and there's a very interesting debate that's been bubbling away in the European Union over the last sort of 5 to 10 years, which is over what over tax competition and over the circumstances under which perhaps countries like the UK and Ireland engage in quote-unquote unfair tax competition by offering exceptionally low corporation tax rates in order to encourage companies to locate there rather than elsewhere. And here again, the evidence, as I understand it, is somewhat mixed, which is to say that there are some very sort of prominent cases of companies appearing to have moved because of because of this or that sort of feature of the tax regime, but the overall and statistical evidence doesn't necessarily seem to predict the simple major movements that you might expect of capital from one jurisdiction to another. And within the European Union, the European Union has much lower regulatory barriers to companies incorporating elsewhere than might be expected in the rest of the world. There's a lot. It's much easier for companies to to shift their operations around. And this, but whether the extent to which this is an empirical phenomenon is uncertain as far as I can see. The extent to which it's a political phenomenon is undoubted. There's been a lot of muttering and complaints from countries like Germany, and this has been a persistent source of tension with the countries which feel that they're losing out, wanting to make these forms of taxation a issue which can be determined by majority voting within the European Union among the member states, so that they have some clout to try and push for higher corporation rates, and of course countries like Britain and Ireland pushing back. And similarly, you have gotten, for example, the efforts to create a common European company statute, which would allow for companies to be set up on a Europe-wide scale, were stymied for decades and eventually greatly weakened because of the fears of some countries that this was going to result in major problems for their, and that German companies, for example, might incorporate as European companies and thus avoid, if not avoid taxation, at least avoid some of the regulatory burdens attached to doing business in Germany. But this is probably much more detail about the European Union than most blogging heads viewers will want to see. I'm an EU specialist, so I tend to wax rhapsodic when I get an opportunity to bring in my pet topic.
Well, I wanted to put in, just before we move to the next topic, I did find a document that establishes the history of the Laffer Curve idea. There's a piece called "The Laffer Curve: Past, Present, and Future," by Arthur B. Laffer himself, that came out in 2004 at the Heritage Foundation, and he says it's the origin of the name occurs in a cast of notorious characters these days. I'll read you just the first paragraph of this. The story of how the Laffer Curve got its name begins with a 1978 article by Jude Winniski in the Public Interest entitled Taxes, Revenues, and the Laffer Curve. As recounted by Winniski, in December 1974, he had dinner with me, that's Laffer, then professor at the University of Chicago, Donald Rumsfeld, chief of staff to President Gerald Ford, and Dick Cheney, Rumsfeld's deputy and my former classmate at Yale, at the Two Continents restaurant in the Washington Hotel in Washington, D.C., while discussing President Ford's whip inflation now proposal for tax increases. I supposedly grabbed my napkin and a pen and sketched a curve on the napkin illustrating the trade-off between tax rates and tax revenues. Winniski named the trade-off the Laffer Curve. So there, and kind of humorously, Laffer says, I kind of doubt this is what happened because that place had cloth napkins, and my mother taught me not to deface anything that was nice. So the napkin part of the story may be apocryphal.
Yeah.
But no wonder people just rabidly attack it if it involves Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, two of the most popular men in America today. I'm sure.
Well, I certainly didn't know that before you, or at least I hadn't picked up on it before you said that. So this I would see not as being an explanation for its unpopularity, but reasons why it might become even more unpopular once.
By the way, the Laffer piece is, I didn't get a chance, just skimmed it beforehand, but it seems like a quite nice overview of his ideas about the effect of tax cuts on revenue over time in sort of U.S. history. So it's where Laffer himself is a real first-rate economist, and so it's worth checking out the case that he makes there. And the other thing I wanted to point out, almost as an angel arriving to help me out in this discussion, Tyler Cowen just posted a paper by I think it's John and Christina Romer at Berkeley, and that is about the effect of tax increases using a very different sort of model. And their paper, it's a new NBER paper. Tax increases are highly contractionary. The effects are strongly significant, highly robust, and much larger than those obtained using broader measures of tax changes. The large effect stems in considerable part from a powerful negative effect of tax increases on investment. I haven't read the paper. That's just what the abstract says. But it's part of this ongoing debate about the effects that tax rates have on the performance of the economy, and of course if tax rates have an effect on the performance of the economy, that's going to have something to do with how much revenue the government's going to raise through taxes. So it's an issue that completely confounds me because of the many variable problems. So it's not something I'm willing to stake a claim on.
Limb on. Yeah. Well, whether you want to step out on a limb or not, it does make a nice segue into another topic we wanted to talk about, which is the fairness of taxes and the fairness of income inequality. And here, particularly, Greg Mankiw's piece in the, I think it was New York Times, wasn't it, talking about this? And,
yes, this weekend, yeah.
Yeah, this is something which, again, has gotten a lot of flack. Some of it because of Brad DeLong gave it flack because he says that it misrepresented the views of both John Rawls and indeed of sorry, my brain has gone temporarily blank. Famous libertarian
Robert Nozick.
Robert Nozick. Something which I'm going to defer to you on completely. I've never, to my shame, read a page either of Nozick or Rawls in my life.
Shame, Henry.
I know.
Shame.
Yeah, I'm a political scientist. I read political theorists, but not necessarily these political theorists. So
yeah.
And then sort of more broad questions about what this says about ideas of equality and inequality as they apply both to income and as they apply to taxation. So, do you want to start off on this one?
Sure. I haven't seen DeLong's response. Can you tell me in a nutshell what he said about Mankiw's getting Rawls and Nozick wrong?
Okay, quick and dirty version, and I may be misrepresenting Brad here, is that he says that so Mankiw represents Rawls is basically giving the case for redistribution in the name of egalitarianism, and Nozick is saying that redistribution is theft. And so DeLong says he doesn't agree with either Rawls or Nozick, but he believes that both of them have been misrepresented here. That contra Mankiw, that redistribution is not the most important thing for Rawls. In fact, freedom is the most important thing, and redistribution is sort of at best and sort of third in the list of priorities. And that for Nozick, so the extent to which it is or is not justifiable to take money from Peter and give it to Paul depends on the extent to which Peter or Peter's ancestors stole it in the first place, or the extent to which Peter has taken away from this Lockean store of sort of common property in some sort of way, and hence has sort of misbehaved in a certain sense. So he's saying that Nozick's position isn't necessarily as opposed to redistribution as Mankiw presents it, and perhaps even as Nozick himself may have presented it to his followers. Brad is not an extraordinary fan of Nozick's personal honesty, which is something which you may disagree with as well. I seem to remember you having written something about this, or maybe it was Julian Sanchez in Reason a couple of years ago.
Well, that's pretty interesting. I see what Mankiw wrote about Rawls here, which is just and this is in fact something of a mischaracterization. Professor Rawls concluded that the primary goal of public policy should be to redistribute resources to help those at the very bottom of the economic ladder. That's a bit of a vulgarization of what Rawls says. Rawls, mostly isn't talking about public policy in a straightforward way. If you're thinking of public policy as like, current legislation or what it is the bureaucrats are doing or whatever the current tax rates are, Rawls's project concerns what he calls the basic structure of society, the sort of basic framework of laws and institutions, and that framework is in part justified by it making the least well off as well off as any other alternative. And he doesn't necessarily have sort of the redistribution of money in mind. Rawls, and he actually slides between these two things in a way that is not, I think, quite rigorous. But he wants to distinguish between distribution, which he thinks is just the sort of pattern that emerges from cooperation according to the basic terms of association that are implicit in the basic structure of society. So if people are just operating freely according to those basic constraints, you'll see a particular pattern of holdings emerge. And he thinks that that's going to be justified just in case that pattern is leaves the worst off as well off as they could otherwise be. But he's not necessarily talking about moving income around. He calls that he calls that allocation as opposed to distribution. So some reallocation of holdings may be a necessary part of justice, but it's not necessarily so. There might be a way of constructing the basic institution such that the pattern of holdings that emerges from it is about as good as you're going to get, and it might not actually require any further any sort of reallocation from the richer to the poorer. So I think that is a bit of a mischaracterization, and of course it's not. And this is one of the things that actually libertarians tend to complain about with Rawls, is that Rawls's view is that there are justices constructed. What his view of justice is called justice as fairness, and it has two components: the first and second principle of justice. And the first principle of justice is the principle of equal liberty, which is basically the sort of Herbert Spencer, John Stuart Mill idea that we should have the maximal amount of liberty that's consistent with everybody else's equal liberty. And he says that is strictly prior, that has a strict logical priority and moral priority to the second principle, which is the one that says that the overall system has to make the worst off as well off as possible. And libertarians often think that if Rawls took his first principle seriously, you'd never really get around to the second principle. And some people actually see Nozick's work in Anarchy State as Utopia as basically being that kind of internal critique of Rawls, that what's going on is that Nozick is specifying what a maximal set of freedoms would mean, and then if we took that seriously, what would be the outcome of that? And you would end up with a system that made it sort of immoral to actually have the state redistribute money to seek a different pattern than the one that already emerged. So that's my 5-minute Rawls v. Nozick primer. The stuff about whether Nozick actually supports more redistribution than you think because his theory depends on a particular idea of just original acquisition is a tricky one. There can be a non sequitur in the idea that if I didn't acquire a piece of property justly, maybe I didn't leave enough and as good as Locke says in the Commons when I acquired it, and then somehow it might be legitimate to take it from me and give it to somebody else. But that's actually an additional step. You'd have to argue why. You'd have to establish that somebody else has the legitimate authority to take it away and to give it to somebody else. So the fact that I don't legitimately own it doesn't quite yet establish that somebody else can legitimately take it away. So there's, and that's not something I think that Rawls or that Nozick ever resolves. But anyway, this is like you talking about the EU, because this is this is what I do.
Yeah, well, exactly. When you get the chance to talk about your specific personal, whatever bee you have in your bonnet, you tend to take advantage of that chance.
Yeah, because who else is going to talk about? But more specifically about Mankiw's article, the point that he's making is that whether you think a particular tax burden is fair or not depends on some sort of prior moral conception you have of fairness or justice, and I think that's pretty obviously true. And Mankiw is, I think, trying to argue that, look, in fact, the top 1% of the income distribution pays something like 30% of the taxes. I'm just making that up because I'm just trying to remember what the chart was. And he's like, that's a lot. That 1% of the people are paying like about a third of the overall tax burden. And I think he's like, well, how much more do you want?
Well, I read the piece as being a rhetorical response to Warren Buffett. It was of Buffett's story, this famous story that Buffett gave of how it is, why the hell is it that he's paying 15% effective tax while his secretary is paying 30%, that this is a sort of Mankiw seeking to respond to this and seeking to scotch this before it becomes a theme for general debate, general discussion. And it seemed to me that there's a point in there. which is that sort of the U.S. system is perhaps more redistributionist than sort of many on the left would give it credit for being, albeit that it has become much less so over the last sort of 10 or 15 years. But there also are a couple of things which are left out of the story. And one of the things that's left out of the story is exactly what we were talking about earlier, which is the opportunities for avoiding tax through clever schemes of one sort or another. And that's something which pretty clearly is not sort of it varies sort of positively with income, which is to say the more money that you have, the more sort of likely you are to investigate cunning schemes through which you can minimize your tax liability, minimize your apparent income, and the extent to which sort of it's possible to measure this is sort of there isn't any very good study, certainly that I've come across, that talks in any depth about how much money is actually lost through tax avoidance schemes of one sort or another. But it's something which very clearly is going to affect people at the top of the income distribution rather more than it is at the bottom. So that, for example, we see this famous story that Paul Krugman talks about in his recent piece in the New York Times, which is the ways in which the managers of various capital funds are able to avoid sort of massive amounts of income tax by taking advantage of a loophole that allows them to treat their income as if it were in fact sort of dividends from capital, so that they only have to pay 15% effective tax on this. And this is something which, it seems to me, at least to some extent, cuts against the argument that in fact we see the people at the top paying more than we think we do. There are a lot of measurement issues there, and it's very, very hard to say how much of sort of the actual income that these people are reporting actually reflects the sort of real income that they are receiving. And the second thing that I thought was a little bit that I had trouble with in the article, he talks about how there's this idea of the people who are rich at the top of the scale being sort of fat cats, sort of basically whooping it up on dividends from stocks, not being hard-working people, and that in fact sort of if we look at the way that sort of income is split up, in fact much more money is being paid by people who are much more income seems to come through actual work rather than dividends than was true in previous eras. But again, this doesn't do justice to this very wide-ranging debate on exactly why it is that senior managers, that CEOs and so on, are getting paid much more than they used to be in the past. And I haven't seen anything that approaches an even vaguely convincing economic efficiency explanation of how this has come about. Most of the arguments that I've seen seem to suggest that there have been, from economists, that there's been some major norm shift which has occurred, which have effectively allowed CEOs to push successfully for much larger shares of the pie than they used to in the past, regardless of their actual performance, that there are various ways in which they can insulate themselves from shareholders in order to do this. And this, again, seems to me to suggest that the implicit contrast that Mankiw seems to be drawing here between tough, hard-working people who have earned their money and capitalist fat cats who may have perhaps been around in the 1920s, 1930s, seems to me to be this distinction seems to me to be at the very least overdrawn. And the final bit that I disagree with, this is something which Mark Thome, I think, said, which seems to me to be a pretty good point, is that Mankiw, when he's talking about how the budget is is not all that badly in deficit, he's basically talking about the fact that there are pretty massive social security surpluses at the moment, and he's basically implying that somewhere down the line these social security surpluses are not going to be paid out. And this gets back to the point about whether or not, when we and Brad DeLong makes this, and Thoma makes this point, when we look at actual taxation, we have to look at deficit spending as being a form of taxation, because somewhere, sooner or later down the line, somebody is going to have to pay for that. And again, there's some evidence out there, Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson referred to this in a piece they did for Perspectives on Politics a couple of years ago. There's some evidence that the cost for future adjustments down the line is very likely going to be paid disproportionately by people in the four bottom quintiles of the income distribution. So those were the problems, I guess, I had with the Mankiw article.
I don't understand that last bit about why would the people at the four bottom quintiles be the ones who are going to bear the tax burden from a sort of like generational tax shift?
This is something Hacker and Pearson talk about it in their article about how the tax cuts came through in the first place. It's an aside which refers to other people's research, which, to be perfectly honest, I didn't have a chance to read before.
Okay,
so
that just didn't follow immediately to me. One of the issues that I'm really interested in that.
My presumption is that the argument is based on Social Security and based on people, sort of people in these lower quintiles being much more dependent upon Social Security than are people in the top quintile when it comes to funding retirement and so on, and the extent to which the burden for deficit spending is going to be soaked up in the future by lower Social Security payments of one sort or another. That's my assumption, but I could be incorrect. As I say, I should have and didn't have a chance to read the article that these guys are referring to before.
Well, Henry, we've talked a heck of a lot about taxes. Do you want to go back and talk about EU regulatory creep? That's got to be exciting.
It's super exciting. Okay, well, this is a piece in the Financial Times, and it was a piece I liked that I wanted to blog about, and I didn't have time to because, as I say, I'm moving. So anyway, here's my spiel on it. It's a very interesting piece. Basically, what it argues is when you look at worldwide regulation, the US isn't setting the pace anymore. It used to be that people assumed the US regulatory standards were going to be the standards that people in other parts of the world actually obeyed and actually complied with. This is not the case. More and more it's the European Union which is doing this, and the European Union regulations, which are being accepted in some cases, albeit not very many, by people within the US. The story begins with an account of how Schwarzenegger has sought to basically tie his trading permits thing into the EU system. But to a much greater extent in other parts of the world, Japan, the developing world, which are basically adhering to EU standards when it comes to products of one sort or another, and that this is proving to be a substantial competitive disadvantage for the US. And this is something which the Financial Times article basically talks to a trend that I have a forthcoming piece that I'm working on with Abraham Newman in Georgetown University, which talks about this. And we've got an argument worked out about it, which I think is borne out by the fact that the Financial Times pushes out there, which is that in order to understand what's happening, you've got to understand two things. First of all, you've got to understand that market size is important. This is something which is a standard of the literature. Dan Dresner, his most recent book and other books that he's written, talks about this an awful lot. That in order to be a player in these games, you have to have a pretty big market. But the second thing that Dan doesn't talk about, and that isn't talked about much in the US debate, is the importance of having a strong regulatory state. And effectively, when you've got a strong regulatory state, you're able to push this stuff, and you're able to push for you're able to push a solution that actually accords with your preferences rather than with the preferences of another country, such as in this example, the US. And so the argument here goes that because the US has decided for free market regulation in so many areas, has not put the the power of the state behind enforcing regulation, but instead allowed companies to come up with their own non-legally enforceable standards, that it's basically tied its hands behind its back and is allowing the European Union to push the pace and to impose regulations from outside, which sooner or later may very well see the US actually beginning to comply with regulations because it finds itself being the odd man out in the global economy. And so what I'm interested in is this seems to me to pose an interesting dilemma for US libertarians. So when I read your colleagues at Cato talking about international issues, by and large they push for international deregulation or self-regulation as being the solution in this, that and the other area. And this is what the US has been pushing for a long, long time, and what it's been pushing for domestically. But the answer that I seem to see coming from the global economy is that self-regulation, what you do by pushing self-regulation is you allow yourself to be open to other regimes such as the European Union to basically to make your companies, make your businesses comply with their regulation rather than yours, and so you end up losing the race before you actually have even entered into it. So,
yeah, well, so I mean, I'm not sure if this is obviously not something that I know a lot about, but a lot of the issue. So the way I understand it is the reason that a different jurisdiction, say like Japan or some other country, would want to adopt EU regulatory standards is that it reduces the transaction costs for trading with Europe, right? That you've by just adopting their standards, you've kind of streamlined the process of trade with this huge market. Is that the basic idea?
That's one of the mechanisms. The second mechanism is a self-regulation thing, and maybe it helps. I'm talking abstract political sciences. If I give a practical example, which is standard-setting organizations within the EU and within the US. In the US, you've got a bunch of different standard-setting organizations, which are basically for-profit entities, more or less, or at least some sort of for-fee entities, which are in competition with each other. So they're in competition to win customers, and so they're duking it out among each other. And the US attitude is, well, let the best regulation, let the best standard win from this decentralized process of markets and whatever, which accords very well with, I think, libertarian priors as to what should work best. EU system is very different. Standard organizations in the EU are much more directly and closely linked to the member states of the EU, and also coordinate to a much greater extent at the level of the European Union itself. What this means is that when you look at international standards, which are set by international standard-setting associations, which involve both US and EU standard-setting organizations together, the US gets consistently steamrollered by the Europeans, because the Europeans are coordinating together through their governments and are able to use this in order to much more effectively set what the international standards are. And this has consequences for US businesses, which find themselves having to comply to European standards in order to meet international standards, and under WTO rules you've got to do your best to meet international standards, and if they don't meet European standards, they basically find themselves being excluded from the international market. So this is an example of how it is that self-regulation may not work in a world where you have other states out there which are determined to press their regulatory powers to the nth degree.
Would you characterize that as a certain kind of regulatory cartelization? Because it seems like part of what the EU, I think C. Boyden Gray, the U.S. representative to the EU, was saying is that a lot of the regulatory schemes that the Europeans are pushing are things that major European industries are already geared up to comply with, which gives them a at least a short-term competitive advantage when it comes to adherence to the standard. And the logic of the trying to push the uniform regulatory scheme is very, very similar to the logic of why, just like what we were talking about earlier, why the people in Brussels would like to be able to harmonize tax structures, because they don't want there to be, if you can coordinate on a certain level of regulation, then you are stronger as a bloc, and you kind of prevent what is perceived to be kind of a race to the bottom in deregulating or lowering your tax rates in order to attract new business. So it's a long-term strategy to try to get your regulatory scheme that advantages your incumbents to expand further and further. Would that partly describe the dynamic?
I think that partly describes it. What Boyden Gray, of course, leaves out is that the US has tried to do this as well, but hasn't been anywhere near as effective in doing it, because, as I say, the argument that I would make, along with my co-author, is that the US has effectively found itself not having the tools necessary to push this through, because it has a fragmented system in which there isn't, in which the state is more or less plays a hands-off role, allows industry to come up with its own stuff, and isn't able to present a coherent and unified position in the same way that the Europeans are.
Excellent. Well, for anyone who's interested in that kind of issue, last month on Cato Unbound we had an issue on globalized regulation with Dan Dresner and a panel of other sort of globalization and regulation specialists. And some of it was a précis of Dan's book and a discussion of it, but some of these issues came up and were discussed at length. So I'd encourage people to go check that out. I think our time's running up, Henry.
I think that's right. Anything final before we close?
Well, I did want to thank you for inviting me to be your Facebook friend. I was very flattered. I feel like we're much closer now, and now you can see, like, if I, heaven forbid, like, lose my girlfriend, or you can tell what I'm doing at any given moment because I always update that. If anybody's given me any cute little electronic icon gifts, you'll be able to see that, Henry, and I'm glad of that.
I feel very proud and honoured that you should entrust me with your Facebook friendship. Seriously, this is something which I'm still trying to figure out. I guess I've been kind of nervously thinking that I should do this for years because I teach courses on politics on the internet. Mm-hmm. Obviously, my students are all doing this. But I was never able to figure out quite what the hell it was supposed to be for. I think I've gotten a somewhat better idea, but only a somewhat better idea from actually engaging in it. And of course, the other thing that you're kind of terrified about is that you're going to, what if you have sort of decided to sort of make a Facebook page and nobody came, and
horror.
The horror.
Mm-hmm. I think that is like the Robert Putnam book of the new millennium, like a Facebooking alone. It sounds terrifying.
It does. Although I have one friend who says that he has a Facebook page which he is maintaining specifically as a statement. He is refusing all friends and refusing any contact with other people, and it's a sort of sissy nepa on Facebook page kind of thing, as a surrealist statement on the desperation.
It's like a tree falling in the forest with no one to hear it.
Exactly, except that I guess he wants everybody to hear it, but nobody to actually sort of be able to join as a friend so that he can stand out as being the one person alone.
Well, it was fun, Henry. We'll see you on Facebook.
I will see you there as well. Okay.
All right.